EPIS Talks on a report on silent diplomacy with Theodore.
And Leonard.
What do you have for us?
I've got an interview with Matthew Wilson.
Who is Mr. Wilson?
Mr. Wilson is the Barbadian ambassador to Geneva in Switzerland and therefore represents Barbados at the United Nations.
What was the conversation with him about?
We've talked about first about his career, how he joined the diplomatic service. Later, we've talked how Barbados took over their foreign relations after their independence in the last century, and also how how climate change impacts the world stage on diplomacy.
What could you learn from that?
That, for example, King Charles is not the king any longer.
That's something you should know when you go to Barbados. Let's take a look into the interview.
Please note, the views presented by the persons involved are their own and do not necessarily represent either the views of EPIS think tank or their own institution.
Matthew, thank you for inviting us to your embassy here in Geneva, as Geneva is one of the international capitals located in Switzerland, and you as the ambassador of Barbados. Why are you the ambassador of Barbados?
That's a loaded question, Theodore. No, thanks so much for kind of reaching out to me, for kind of giving a platform for an ambassador from a small island developing state to be able to highlight their priorities. Essentially, this is an incredible place to be an ambassador, if I'm honest with you. A huge part of my work is doing trade negotiations at the World Trade Organization. But here in Geneva, you also cover human rights issues. You do labor issues. So Barbados is a member of the governing body of the International Labour Organization. We do health issues. Barbados is on the executive board of the World Health Organization. You do IP issues at WIPO, digital issues at ITTU, a huge range of issues that you cover here, which is excellent for a small state because you are able to see how everything connects. You're able to see how everything interacts with each other. You can see the push and pull. So it's a really fascinating place to be an ambassador and to represent a small country at a time where our priorities and our needs and our voice has never been higher, especially when it comes to the climate crisis. Small island states like Barbados, I think, have been at the forefront of highlighting why we need to deal with these issues. We need to look at climate financing. We need to look at mitigation, at adaptation. So it's really quite a privilege to be representing a small state with such a large voice at this particular point in time.
So you mentioned Barbados being involved in various affairs of diplomacy. Why are you involved in these affairs? You studied international relations and international studies. So did you already know from as a little young boy that you wanted to become an ambassador?
No, far from. And this is why I always tell when I speak to students and interns, don't put so much pressure on yourself to know exactly what you want to do when you're 15, 16, 17, even 2021, because things evolve. I always say try out different things and see where is the best fit for you, where you feel that you're being able to give of all of your capacity. So no, I mean, I think I wanted to be a lawyer at one point in time. So I did law, history, and economics. And then I did psychology and sociology. And I have to say the psychology part, which is such a pivotal component of understanding diplomacy, understanding people, and knowing how to navigate, has been probably one of the most important degrees I've done. Understanding people and why they behave the way they do, because countries are essentially just a load of people. So, it's important to understand why countries do what they do. And then you're right, I did international relations, and then I did another master's in development studies.
Yeah.
And then just recently, maybe 2 years ago, I did a MBA Essentials because it's important to always keep learning, to always keep studying, to always keep exploring new ideas out there, and to keep your brain moving in terms of research and studying. So that's kind of been the trajectory. And it was not something that I necessarily thought I was going to get involved in. After I passed the lawyer phase, I really wanted to get into organizational psychology. But through a simple quirk and twist of fate, I ended up doing international relations, and I found something that I was good at. I think it's always important when your passion meets something that you're actually good
Yeah,
at.
yeah.
It was something where I found I could make a mark, and it was so interdisciplinary, which I loved, because you're dealing with history, you're dealing with anthropology, law, economics, diplomacy, everything together in this one big bundle of international relations. So I found it was something that really spoke to me. But as with most of us, you leave university and you don't get the ideal job that you want. And I did what a number of us do in the Caribbean. I worked in a bank for maybe 4 months as a loans officer.
Yes.
And
Right
then
after the studies? Or?
right after the
Yeah.
studies, and then I applied for my Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and I got a call back, and the rest is history. I did that job in Barbados for about 4 or 5 years. Then I was posted right here to Geneva as a young 25-year-old in 2002, as first secretary in this exact office, rather exact building, but the office which is right opposite my current office.
I see, yeah.
I did that for a couple of years and I absolutely loved it. And then I decided it was time to move from representing a country to then having a more global perspective. And I worked at the World Trade Organization doing development work.
Was it still within your duties of the Foreign Affairs
No,
Office?
no, I left. I left the
Yeah.
Ministry of Foreign Affairs and I
Yeah.
applied for a job at the World Trade Organization. Became the first Barbadian, or rather the first Caribbean ever in the cabinet of a director general. I worked with Pascal Lamy. He was a director general at the time. And that was an incredible experience learning from somebody who is a real master of trade, politics, and diplomacy.
This is a short break just to explain what the World Trade Organization is. The WTO is an international organization that regulates global trade between nations. Established in 1995, it provides a framework for negotiating trade agreements, resolving disputes, and ensuring that trade flows freely, smoothly, and predictably. The WTO aims to reduce trade barriers and promote economic cooperation among its 164 member countries. Now, let's hear what the ambassador experienced working at the WTO.
How was it for you as a first Caribbean being in such an office?
Huge amount of pride and responsibility, because you're representing not just yourself, you're representing your community, you're representing the whole region, and you're representing all the different parts of who you are as an individual as well. So I have a lot of younger people in the Caribbean who I think look at myself and my other contemporaries, with the knowledge that there's a path that they can also go on, that you can move from being in
I see,
Barbados
yeah.
or Dominica or St. Lucia and be working at the top of your game in an international organization. So it's really important that people like me and my colleagues kind of create those pathways for those who are coming behind us.
Being like the first ones there and therefore show that it's also possible.
Yeah, but making sure you do a good job, because it's so easy to be the first, but it's just as easy to be the last. So it's really important that you do a good job, you represent, you do it with integrity, you have accountability, you show up and you do what you have to do, and you do it well.
So there are still Caribbeans being represented in these offices.
Oh yeah, I didn't close the door. There were a few that came after me, which is great.
You mentioned that you studied all sorts of things like law, psychology, history, economy. Um, was it a joint degree, like a degree with touching all sorts of things, or were these like different degrees in different studies?
So in the Caribbean, after high school, you go
Yeah.
into the equivalent of college,
Mhm.
and that's where I did law, history, and economics. Those three together. It was like an associate degree, and then the undergrad was the sociology and psychology,
Yeah.
and then the master's was international relations, and then it was another master's in development studies. So it was, yeah.
I myself have also studied law, and therefore kind of have the background with law myself. And I figured out that a lot of people think that international law and international relations is just the boundary of, or is just a bundle of norms and laws and I would say, as you mentioned, that psychology is more important than that. How would you describe the importance of these different studies regarding your work here?
I may disappoint you with this one, Theodore, but I did not necessarily enjoy law. And I have to admit,
Myself neither.
really, okay. I only did it for 2 years, and
Yeah.
it was, and I understand that you have to stick with these things. Those first 2 years was about learning case law, was kind of regurgitating.
Mhm.
There wasn't as much space for interpretation as I would have liked. So it wasn't necessarily something that spoke to me. I understand completely the importance of it, especially during trade negotiations and human rights law. Completely understand, but it wasn't for me. I
Because
needed.
it's more technical? Or-
It just didn't. It didn't at that point in time appear to give me the space to think as independently as I would like.
I see. Yeah.
Whereas history allows you to also interpret historical facts against things that are happening today and things that may or may not happen in the future. Um, Economics, I think is always good to have, but it was really when I got into the study of people and processes, which is psychology and sociology,
Mm.
that I really found something that I connected with. And international relations for me just took that to another level.
As we came here in Geneva, for which we visit the first time, we also had like the obligatory stop at the United Nations building with all the flags in rows, and we did a nice picture there. And therefore, a lot of people, when coming to international relations, think of flags. You also got some standing here. The VTO, the WTO, is something which just doesn't appear in the mind on the first hand. What is the role of the WTA? Can you lay that out a bit?
The WTO essentially regulates how we trade, and trade is such a valuable concept for anyone involved in international relations, actually in any job, to understand, because everything that we have, everything that we do, is a component of trade in it. I mean, the iPhone that I have there has, you know, components from 30 to 40 different countries, all traded. The food that we eat, everything here. I've just offered you some sweets
Yes.
from Barbados. That is trade. Cashew nuts from Ghana. That is trade. So I think it's really important that we understand that trade is an everyday issue. Is not something esoteric and far removed from how we operate every day. And from agriculture trade to e-commerce to fishery subsidies, which is a big issue we're discussing right now at WTO, trade and environment, SPS, which is sanitary measures. These are all elements of what we discuss at the WTO. So sometimes I feel it's a real pity that that trade is not brought a little bit closer to the ground, because it is the thing that we all live and do every single day.
And so you covered now the trade policy. Is the WTO also concerning about economic development?
Oh, completely. I will say, though, it has been an evolution. At the very beginning, when you had the GATT and then you had the WTO, which this year is celebrating 30 years, it was very much, I think, about very hard trade law, rules and regulations. Things have evolved because as the nature of this world has evolved, as the power balances have evolved, as the characters who have been engaged in trade issues have evolved, the WTO has also had to evolve and to look not just at rules and regulations, but also how can it help countries be able to take advantage of these rules and regulations. So they have a whole program there called Aid for Trade, which is essentially about how development assistance and investment can help developing countries to be able to really grow through trade and develop through trade. Because you have to be intentional about these things. Sometimes there's no automaticity, especially when you're a small country, which is very much on the fringes of the markets and of the global supply chains. You have to be quite intentional about how you use trade as a vector to grow. And the WTO, I think, has matured into an organization that understands it has to be about trade and development, and rather trade and sustainable development.
Being mutual benefits.
Completely.
Yes. Coming on the last question to your personal career and to your personal development, you speak English and French. Is that I hope so. I was informed. We googled it. Is that something which you grew up with, or which you learned by becoming an ambassador?
No, I mean, I did French when I was at secondary school for 5 years. I was not, I would
Okay,
say,
we correct that
I wasn't,
information.
shall we say, top of the class.
Yeah.
But I've been here for many, many years, and I definitely have a working knowledge of French. I mean,
Yeah.
I think it's difficult to be here and not do that. But I mean, let's also be honest, is that English is probably the default language in diplomacy. Don't tell the French I said that, but it's true. So that's usually the
Considering
language.
we are in the French part of Switzerland, right?
Exactly. But that's the language that is really used here as a
Yeah.
common language. So I mean, I haven't had to, I would say, dig as deep into my French skills as I probably thought I would have had to. But I have great admiration for some of these delegates who come here who speak 4 or 5 different languages, or who English is not their first language, and they have to engage sometimes in very technical terms using English. So I have great admiration for them.
When we now come to Barbados, the country you represent, Barbados, and I hope we get that information right now, has around 290,000 people,
Mhm.
and you being the ambassador, delivering delivering the how do you say that, their opinions, their interests in the world. What is the interest of these 290,000 inhabitants?
I mean, 290,000 people is probably like a small town in Berlin.
Yes, a small part.
A small town in Germany, I should say. So, I mean, I understand that it doesn't seem that impactful, but the beautiful thing about diplomacy and international relations is no matter how big you are or how small you are, at least in theory, you have an equal voice, an equal vote, and you have an equal seat at the table. And the important thing for me and for Barbados is that it's not only about representing things that directly affect us as a country, or us as a population. It's about also serving things that are of the global good and supporting the global commons. And that's something where I think Barbados really excels, where we do things and we support things and we involved in things which don't only affect us directly. And I think that's important. And I think if more countries did that, if more countries had that approach to protecting the global commons, and speaking and on issues that don't necessarily affect them directly but affect others, I think we would be in a much better place than we are now. But to get a little bit more granular, you're right. I mean, I do have, I guess, a first priority to represent the interests of my country. And that is very much about addressing the climate crisis, because small island developing states are definitely on the front lines of the climate crisis. Just a few weeks ago, we had a hurricane, the earliest ever formed Category 5 hurricane in history, that just burrowed through the Caribbean and really destroyed the infrastructure in a few Caribbean countries. So this is something which is very personal to us. This is not theoretical. When I go back home, I see the impacts of the climate crisis every day. I see the rising sea levels. I see the heating oceans, which affects the coral reefs, affects the migration of the fish. Tourism is our biggest industry. Almost 80 to 85% of our GDP
Yeah.
is tourism.
Mm-hmm.
And you can imagine the ravages of climate change, how that could impact on our biggest GDP earner, tourism. So these things are very personal. So we really have been advocating for more attention to be given to climate change adaptation and mitigation, more money to go into things like loss and damage funds. So we really have had a much bigger voice than you would think given our population and our size. So it
Yeah.
really has been quite amplified, especially through the voice of my Prime Minister, Mia Amor Motley, who has really been at the front lines of doing this. But like I said, it's also about representing things that are bigger than you as an individual, you as a community, and you as a country. So supporting human rights all over the world, supporting gender equality, supporting diversity and inclusion, supporting access to finance for least developed countries. These are all things, supporting access to medicines. Barbados is very much involved in issues around health, such as non-communicable diseases, AMRs. These are all things that we are very much involved in. So we see our role not just as representing and pushing for a very narrow base of interest, but things that really do have an impact on the global society.
When I asked about the Barbadian interests, you also mentioned in another sentence a lot of the other countries which are mutual to you with the other islands in the Caribbean Sea. Are therefore the Barbadian interests relatively equal to the other countries' interests?
That's a great point. And frankly, just this morning, I came from two meetings where we were with, I would say, like-minded states. We had a big meeting with small island developing states from the Caribbean, from the Pacific, from the Indian Ocean, from Africa, where we are.
So all across the world.
Yeah, where we were discussing how we can have joint positions in the Geneva ecosystem. And then I came from another meeting, the African, Caribbean, and Pacific States, ACP, where Barbados will now be chairing that from September onwards. And that's bringing together the African, the Caribbean, and the Pacific countries together on trade issues. So it's very much about strength in numbers and also looking at commonalities and mutual support.
It's interesting to hear from these other communities of states, the SIDS, the Small Islands Developing States. The other one was the Africa?
ACP.
ACB.
ACP.
ACP.
Africa, Caribbean, Pacific.
ACB. Because we as Europeans, we have the European Union in mind, we have NATO in mind. You hear a lot about that in the news, but you never hear about these smaller communities, which also make quite a huge impact, I would say, in diplomacy. What is their impact? What are some recent achievements?
Yeah, I mean, I have to go back again to the climate change issues.
Sure.
And a particular submission that I want to put on your radar is the Bridgetown Initiative. Now, this was a bit of a call to action that came from Barbados initially, and then supported by a number of small island developing states, then supported by a number of larger states, including countries like France and the UK and Germany. And that essentially called for a reassessment of the international financial architecture, saying that the financial architecture that came after the World War is no longer fit for purpose in the IMF and the World Bank, and frankly also in the UN Security Council, and that these needed to be reformed. You needed to look at having more concessional financing going to vulnerable countries. Frankly, they needed to take this notion of vulnerability into account when they're looking at financing and the disbursement of loans and grants. And so it really did catch the attention of the world, if I'm honest with you. And already we're seeing some really impactful outcomes. The Loss and Damage Fund, which was discussed at COP, was one key component of the Bridgetown Initiative.
Let me interrupt again to tell you what the Bridgetown Initiative actually is. It's led by Barbados Prime Minister Mia Mottley, and it seeks to reform the global financial system to support developing countries. It aims to improve access to financing for climate resilience and development, advocate for debt relief, and promote sustainable economic growth, addressing financial and climate challenges faced by vulnerable nations. The similarity to the name of Barbados' capital city is just a mere smink of diplomacy. Let's continue.
The World Bank and IMF and other regional development banks are now including climate change clauses in their accounts, in their loans, so that in the event that a country has a climate-related disaster, natural disaster rather, there's a pause on their repayment.
I see.
Because if you look at the reality now, I have to tell you, small countries in particular and countries in Africa are paying back more on loans than they're paying to invest in education, housing, gender equality, healthcare in their
Financial
country.
burden getting
And
too
that
great.
cannot be right.
I see, yeah.
That cannot be right. So there's something wrong about the way that the international financial architecture is providing assistance to countries, just make this circle of indebtedness. So it was also about, we need to look at how this system works or does not work and seek to improve it. So for me, that was a huge win coming from, again, a small country with a big voice. And my main learning message from this was, it's really easy to put forward problems, but it's really important that you put forward solutions as soon as you put forward a problem. And that's what we did. Because it's really easy to say, I have an issue here, I have an issue there. It is more challenging to say, I have an issue here, and here's a solution I would like to propose, and here it is, step by step by step. And that's exactly what we did. And that for me is a lesson, not just for diplomacy, but a lesson for life. No matter how small you are, come with your own homemade solutions, look to build coalitions and partnerships and consensus, and then you can really have a bigger bang for your buck there.
Was that how you got UK, France, and Germany on your side?
Because I think they understood. I mean, it was also common sense in a way, and it was also, shall we say, it's difficult to use the word morality when it comes to these issues, but it was also the moral thing to do. It's the ethical thing to do.
To help a nation which is smaller, which is endangered, which is suffering, or
Yeah, especially when, let's be clear, that the climate crisis has been historically caused by a few larger developed countries. There's a huge imbalance there. So it's hard that when you have not caused something, but you are in the front lines of being impacted by it, that you are then expected to pay the same way that those who have historically caused something are paying. So it's also about having a very moral, ethical, fair. Fairness is such an undervalued concept
yeah.
in diplomacy, a fair view of how these things should unfold.
When, as our report is called Small Nations, Silent Diplomacy, we're trying to understand what the relations, the diplomatic relations of these countries are. And as you now mentioned, it would be a fair treatment. It would be fair if you guys would accept that or would be in our side. Is that, for example, if they don't concur with that, would that, how would it affect the diplomatic relations? Would that also affect other relations, for example, trade relations, or some other relations?
Power imbalance is a real thing, and it doesn't make sense. Comparing the balance sheet of a Germany and the balance sheet of a Barbados. It simply does not. However, it starts to look different when you realize in the UN, Germany has one vote and Barbados has one vote. Or in the WTO, Germany sits behind the EU, and Barbados has its own independent seat. And it's the same thing in WHO, same thing in ILO. In a way, these institutions help to democratize things. And you see that come out when you have issues like candidatures, or you have voting at the UN General Assembly or certain resolutions. Then you realize, well, maybe it doesn't matter that one country has 1.2 billion people and another country has 300,000. They can both have an influence in certain ways because their vote is kind of seen as having the same impact. And then when you put 35 small island developing states together, that's quite a powerful coalition. Despite how small they could be, it's still a powerful coalition. So I think it is never wise for big powers to ignore the priorities of smaller powers. I think it's good to be inclusive and to try to see how you can meet everyone's priorities as much as you can. No one is ever going to get 100% of what they want, but it's important that you don't leave countries feeling so naked from their requests that they start to feel resentful. Because there's nothing worse than making people or countries feel powerless.
When you mentioned the countries with a seat and everybody got an equal vote and can accept it or not, there's some veto powers, and one is very much related to Barbados, having the same head of state with King Charles. How is the relations of Barbados with the UK?
Well, we got independence from the UK in 1966, and then I think it was 3 years ago we decided that we would have our own head of state. So that is our head of state there, a lady. She's our president.
Oh.
So we no longer have King Charles as our head of state. We have decided that part of the natural evolution of independence is to have your own head of state. And it also sends a very, very powerful signal to your population that one day, one of us could be our president.
That's an
And
interesting thought. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah. So we no longer have the king. We no longer have the queen. We no longer have the king. Now the important thing is when we did the transition, King Charles, who was Prince Charles at the time, actually came to Barbados for the ceremony.
Yeah.
So there was no love loss. We have excellent relations with the UK. They are our largest partner in terms of tourism arrivals. We have a great historical partnership. Nothing has been shattered at all.
So it was also important for Barbados to upkeep the relations and to send a strong message to to their own people, but I guess also to the world, saying like, we're a sovereign country and therefore one of us sovereign is one of ours, right?
Yeah, I mean, we were always sovereign from 1966 onwards, but this step said something, even psychologically, as a country, that we are going to appoint our own person as our president.
With the last minutes,
Excuse me.
with the last minutes, I wanted to get on the very last point, as we in our report with the small nations speak with a lot of representatives who represent countries which in one point became independent from the UK. Is interesting how they build up their foreign relations, as they started with a blank sheet and now what do we do? How did Barbados start with foreign relations? What were the challenges they posed?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, of course, we have the Commonwealth, which helped us, which is the UK, Australia, Canada,
Yeah.
New Zealand, and all of the ex-colonies, shall we say. So that kind of created a bit of a community, who was our immediate first port of call, because we all have the same legal system. We all had essentially the same civil society, civil service system, spoke the same language. So that was our first port of call. But then one of the first things we did when we became independent was we joined the United Nations as an independent member. And our first Prime Minister, El Barrow, he has a very famous quote that says, friends of all, satellites of none.
I'm sorry?
Friends of all, satellites of none.
Oh,
Which
yeah.
means that we will have good relations with everyone, but we're not pawns of anyone.
I see, yeah, yeah.
So don't use us as a pawn, don't use us as a plaything. We will be your friend, your colleague. We will work together for shared interests, but we are not a country to be taken advantage of, and we haven't been.
And is the diplomacy sector growing in your country because you more and more depend on reaching out to other nations to find solutions
Completely.
for more and more global affairs?
And not just diplomacy, but also for trade and investment.
Yeah.
So more and more we're looking at creating relations with South partners, especially in Africa. When I first joined the Foreign Service, we had no missions, no embassies in Africa.
Yeah.
Now we have one in Kenya. We have one in Ghana. We just opened a mission in Ireland, because obviously the UK was our kind of more natural port of call to the EU. But after Brexit, we decided it would make sense to also strengthen our relation with another island country, Ireland. In
Dublin, then.
In Dublin. In the past 15 years, we've opened in China, we've opened in Brazil, in Panama, in UAE. And this is all linked to our economic and growth strategy as well. It's about finding new trade and investment linkages, especially when it comes to the circular economy and investment in green technology. That's also part of our diplomatic outreach. Because one thing that I've been told when I took this job is, you're not just up here to do the normal diplomatic day-to-day. You're also here to do commercial diplomacy, which is to build business linkages as well, which is to showcase your products and services of the country and to look for investment opportunities. So the whole way that we do diplomacy is changing.
Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you
very much for your insights. And I guess with the development you've just shown, I guess there's a huge potential of growth. Looking forward to that. And thanks again.
Thank you so much for this opportunity. It was great.